I want to react to this video, but I first want to make sure everybody understands. And this is where things get a little tricky. This person is using AI. This is not their voice. And I know it because there's another video I'm going to react to them where they use AI, and I would say illegally, because they're pretending to be a historian who I know of, who is part of the BBC, and they put a video of them as if they're debunking Afrocentrists. So let's get into the video.
So deeply melanated African populations are going to be people who are adapted for the African climate and for the African environment.
So why would they need sunscreen? In most of his videos, TKM obsessively glorifies black skin, hyping melanin up as if it were some supernatural shield.
So I'm going to address the other thing about sunscreen later, but first let's address this thing about the shield. Yes, melanin does act like a shield, and of course melanin is not restricted in Africa. Indians have melanin, South Asians, Native Americans, all these people have melanin in their skin, which helps when it comes to living around the sun. And not surprisingly, a lot of those people live very close to the equator or very hot climates.
But if this so-called magical melanin were superior, as he insinuates, then sunscreen would be unnecessary and blacks would be exempt from its use.
So while African skin, especially the much darker one, has a natural protection against the skin being ruined by the sun, it's not infinite protection. There are some problems that can be caused, especially aesthetically. One of the problems that can happen, and if you're an artist, you already know this, because the sun shines in the most, it first takes up the most forward parts of the face. So in other words, the forehead, the cheeks, the nose, the upper lip, those parts can darken first than other parts of the body, which will cause an uneven look, and can even, because those places absorb it first, this is why you wear a cap, those places could even get ruined or start getting bumps and stuff like that. This is why Africans wear plenty of sun shields. For example,
ever wondered why the Himba people of Namibia have bright red hair and skin? It's not dye. It's a mix of red clay and animal fat. Living in a dry desert, they bathe in herbal smoke instead of water. This clay protects them from the sun and also symbolizes beauty and identity.
Sun shields in Africa are found all over the continent. These ones are Xhosa, which are usually used by women to protect themselves, especially since Xhosa women who are mixed with Khoisan tend to have a lighter skin. And to preserve that, you can put this. Now, this is from Mozambique, and Mozambican people also use the same thing, even though they tend to be a little darker than the other people, but they still use it because it protects them from the sun and you avoid dark marks that come specifically from the sun. The next few ones are from Madagascar, and in Madagascar, they utilize the same thing in order to avoid dark marks and breakouts. One of the most annoying things that can happen is if you're not taught about how the body works as a kid, is you could think you're growing pimples or something like that. Meanwhile, you're spending too much time in hot areas, and then you get pimples, and then you pop them, and then now you have permanent marks in your body. Meanwhile, it had something to do with the heat, and a few days later, it would have disappeared because of your youth. This can be a permanent problem. This is why Africans in the past, who spent all their time, not all of it, working out how to survive in this type of environment, came up with this type of system so that you can be indoors in a place where there's literally a fire indoors, and you guys can remain with perfectly unique, nice skin. The reason this person associates sunscreen with white people, one, probably because he's white, but two, because he does not understand reality. He does not look into other people's culture. Instead, he just estimates. And by the way, this is not something that is limited to Africa. Of course, Indians used to protect their skin as well from the sun, and Egyptians and Middle Easterners and Europeans. Everybody used to protect themselves against the sun. Now, here's the second part, which he's not going to mention. Africans had to protect themselves against the cold as well, which is why they use so many oils, whether it's body fat, whether it's creams from plants, whether it's from roots or whatever. And the reason for this is because once it gets too cold, your body starts to give away water droplets. And if enough goes away, your skin starts to feel weird and it starts to crackle a little bit. And so by putting these oils, you can capture that moisture. These are the subtle ways that Africans who were very in touch with their own body spent all their time creating stuff so that they can preserve the way they look. Now, some people have no idea about these technologies. People in makeup and stuff like that, they're aware of the history of it, but some people have no idea and they don't understand, and so they make ridiculous statements like Africans didn't use sunscreen.
Yet of all places, the oldest testament to sunscreen is in ancient Egypt, not sub-Sahara, not the Levant, not Europe.
Another blatant lie. Red ochre found 40,000 years ago in sub-Saharan Africa. Archaeological evidence and modern practices of Himba people in Namibia suggest that early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals may have used red ochre, a natural clay pigment containing ferrous oxide, as a protective skin coating against the sun, possibly aiding survival during periods of weakened magnetic field and increased solar radiation. The Himba women still use a paste of red ochre, butter, and fat called ochize for sun protection and cosmetic reasons. Now, here's the thing. The red ochre is used by Zulu, used by Xhosa, used by Sutu, whatever. Pick any type of people in Southern Africa, they still use it. That red ochre was traded thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago throughout Africa. So we know that red ochre is one of the most typical things that you can find in Africa, and they found real early. It actually goes along with the earliest paintings in Africa, or the earliest sketch in Africa as well is done with red ochre. So yes, the oldest sunscreen is made from African red ochre, way before the one that's in Egypt, which of course would still be Africa. But in his head, he thinks he's building up a great argument, when in real life, all he's doing is lying to himself.
And that simple fact alone guts the Black Egypt fantasy. He lost the plot, but never had it in the first place. Afrocentrics will argue, why would Eurasians invent sunscreen in Egypt instead of Eurasia? Well, the answer is simple. Egypt is one of the hottest, sunniest environments in the region, a fact even this genius will admit, which means Eurasian settlers in Egypt had every reason to innovate sun protection there.
So there's a lot of falsehoods that are over here. First of all, the ancient Greeks did have sun protection. That was because, they don't live so far where the sun never shines at all. And then, of course, Asia, like, you think people in Asia didn't have sun protection? Of course they did. And then, of course, Egyptians obviously had it because the sun there is blaring, as he mentions. But there's a couple problems in what he's saying, which is, it starts off, this is one of the problems. So he's trying to put himself out as like, this is like some deeply researched thing, but he's already starting with some falsehoods about Europeans never using anything to protect the sun from the sun. Now, it is true that a lot of Europeans did not protect themselves against the sun in the same way that Africans would, because Africans live directly under the sun all the time, a fact that he did not know. But they did utilize other things to try and make up for it. Like, for example, they would mix, in at least the Roman warriors, they would mix olive oil with sand and then put it on themselves. And then there are some other people who would do all kinds of other things, but we don't really need to get into it. But this is the problem with it. It's like, do you really think people would just sit in the sun and just wait to fall over? And like, they know how to get over this type of thing. Of course, not all societies bothered with this, especially men in Africa. A lot of the time, the men would put paint over themselves and stuff like that, but men have never really been as caring about their physical appearance as women are.
According to Aldahan et al. 2015 and Manaki 2009, ancient Egyptians used sunscreens. Skincare products and practices in ancient Egypt were traded to Greece and Rome. The ancient Romans and Greeks employed many of the same ingredients as the Egyptians did, using them similarly and for similar purposes.
Yeah, but that goes against what you said, saying that the people in Greece wouldn't need sunscreen, saying that people in Europe wouldn't need it. They only need it when they come to the harsh environment of Africa. But that doesn't make sense. Clearly, they still needed it there. That's why they utilized it.
Ancient Egyptians never traded or shared sunscreen techniques with black-skinned South Sudanese Nilotics, did they? I don't think so. TKM says black people were adapted, so they wouldn't have had a need. Instead, ancient Egyptians shared and traded with Greeks and Romans.
So again, more made up nonsense. So here it says many Nubians lived along the Nile and curved northwards through the desert. Farmers grew grains, peas, lentils, dates, and possibly melons, but especially important were their herds of cattle, a measure of wealth and social status. In the desert, Nubians mined carnelian and gold, as well as other minerals and resources, bartering cattle, gold, carnelian, ivory, animal skins, hardwood, incense, and dates. Nubians traded with the Egyptians, their neighbors to the north, for grain, vegetables, oils, wine, beer, linen, and other manufactured goods. So, yes, with the south, Egyptians traded all the time. All the time. They traded, sunscreen being one of them. Now, of course, the sunscreen used in Egypt basically goes down to, under oils, rather than the sunscreen that we use today, which technically is an emulsion. I think that's how you say the word. An emulsion, for those of you that don't know, is the mix of oil and water. Now, I'm sure you've all heard this saying, oil and water don't mix. This is not true in all cases. In a lot of cases, oil and water do mix. And when they do mix, they create a word called an emulsion. And some very common examples of this are stuff like the sunscreens used by Africans. Other ones would include just paints in general, and several other things that you will find in Africa. But, we can get back to that in another time. Africans also use insects. So they would use animal fat, mix it with insects, and you would get this paint type thing. So oil and water does mix sometimes. I would be committing a grave error if I didn't throw out a theory out there that I've heard before. So there is a theory by people which actually makes a little bit of sense if you consider the history. So remember, the white color that sometimes Africans would put over their body as a religious symbol. I've made videos about this. You can look into it if you want to. Ethiopia, West Africa, Southern Africa, they all do this. They cover themselves in white to resemble religiousness. And someone once told me that because women would cover their face in paint to protect themselves against the sun, that is actually what they're trying to portray with the yellow color. that actually the woman, which you don't necessarily have to put it over your face only, as you saw with the Himba people, they would cover themselves in that color, and that is what you're seeing, and that is why they're being related to a religious experience.
Isn't that interesting? And since blacks were magically adapted and their skin is so amazingly superior to everyone else, as insinuated by these racists, why would blacks need umbrellas or flabella?
So I find it interesting that he accuses the Afrocentrists of racism. But then something else that is weird about this is that he is doubting that the African skin is built or adapted for the sun. But at the same time, he's making the argument that since it's not built for the sun, or since it is built for the sun, the umbrella is something that is not necessarily useful. Now, of course, we know that there were umbrellas in Africa, which I'll get back to, but I just want to lay that out there that his argument makes no sense in this way. Either he accepts that Africans don't need stuff like umbrellas and sunscreen, and that their skin is superior in that sense, in the sense that it is made so that you can live in very hot climates, but also you can live in very cold climates too.
Notice Tutankhamun's servants or slaves carrying his traditional ceremonial flabella bear no resemblance to the Nilotic enemies he tramples underfoot during battle. The Nilotics share neither phenotype or skin tone of Tutankhamun or his soldiers.
So this is an old trick. The thing that he focuses on, by the way, this image has been darkened, but we'll just work with it for now. The previous one is of Nilotic type people, right, being trampled. This one is of Asiatic people being trampled. Now, he goes and says, notice the differences, which again, notice the differences between how the Asiatics are painted, who are being trampled over here by Tutankhamun, and notice how Tutankhamun himself is portrayed. By the way, this image is not an image of real life, neither the Nilotic or the Asiatic one. This is an image of propaganda. Of course, Tutankhamun was never at any age where he could do any of this stuff.
There was no technological innovation of the umbrella in Sub-Sahara. It was only introduced much later through Mediterranean cultural diffusion.
So that's made up nonsense. I know the umbrella looks like it's one of the greatest inventions ever made, but in real life, the umbrella is just a secondary part of picking up a shield and putting it over your head, or taking up a cloth, putting sticks around and then holding it up with a stick. It is a pretty impressive invention. I'm not saying it would have been done in 5 seconds, but Africans did have this invention. And surprise, surprise, they use it in the same way that the kings of Egypt did, basically to cover up the king. Everybody else is pretty much walking around in a non-shaded way, but there's people walking around covering the king and the newly Portuguese people who are now converting these people into Christianity. You can see there's a cannon being fired. Like a lot of the Egyptian fans that existed in Africa that are similar to the fans found in Egypt, and remember, they traded these fans with one another. The umbrella was a religious symbol, both in the Kingdom of Congo and in Asantina, which Baldrick T. Edward goes to explain existed prior to Moors or any other people coming down and giving this to those people. The umbrella, in a weird way, is a combination of the hut style and a mix of using the shield to cover yourself. It's basically creating a mobile hut covering, which obviously blocks you out from the sun. And there are some parasols which are made from this type of material, which have been found in Africa, where you still have the sticks, but you don't have the straw part. Now, of course, other parts of Africa had cotton and all types of stuff early on, so they didn't rely on this type of thing. Notice, by the way, how most of the African umbrellas are mainly for blocking out the sun rather than other umbrellas that are used to block out the rain. The umbrella, African umbrella, that would have been invented in this way, obviously would have been using a lighter stick and it wouldn't be just a pole in the ground, would be more effective for the rain and had been used.
That with the blazing sun in sub-Sahara, temples would be everywhere offering shade, yet not a single monumental stone temple was ever built. None. Zero.
So, of course, because of their confidence in their ignorance, they say things that are so completely incorrect. I actually want you to look at some of these boats that are in these images, and you can see that even they have a cover on top of it. So it's not just a boat in the normal sense. So you can see here these boats have a sort of cover in the same way that an umbrella would work. But I just noticed that right now. I just wanted to put that in there. Now, obviously, in terms of mega structures, we hear from the report from the Kingdom of Congo, a written story about Congo, a written reality about Congo, that Mbaza Congo existed prior to the Europeans getting there, and it was a giant castle-like structure that is on the hill, mimicking that found in Great Zimbabwe and many other places, except that Mbanza Congo was actually not thatched roofed or anything like that. It's a proper castle-like structure. We can go to Iwelatan, we can go to Mauritania, we can go to those found in Timbuktu, we can go to Nigeria where they have tons of mega structures. But yeah.
Meanwhile, temples are scattered across the Levant, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Europe. Gobekli Tepe.
Okay, so I wasn't going to show these, but since he went and tried to say what he said, I'm just going to visually show them. So this one is from northern Nigeria. This one is also from Nigeria. This one is from Niger, northern Niger. This one is from Libya, Ethiopia, obviously, and Southwest Africa. You know what's weird? There's so many ruins in Africa that I actually at one point stopped uploading them because I got bored with them. There's a lot of people like they didn't make double stories. I literally got bored because there's so many that it just becomes not interesting after a while. When you realize the Swahili coast all had buildings, Southern Africa, there's a whole bunch of buildings in those regions. You go to Congo, they've got a whole bunch of buildings there, especially ramped up in the later periods. You've got Gabon, which has got stuff like this. You've got Nigeria, which is filled with them, by the way. They had too much of them, in my opinion, in some places. And you've got Iwalatan, you've got Mauritania, and all those other places that also have an excessive number of them. You also have the Asentina buildings, which, described by Bodwick T. Edward, had flushing toilets, and they also had scented, well, not necessarily candles, but they had oils with scents on them so that the house could stay fresh. They literally had all kinds of things around their buildings. And again, I like buildings and I like architecture in general, but there's so much of them that it literally is not an interesting question anymore whether Africa built buildings or not. And they're so diverse that actually, in my opinion, they're more interesting than the ones found outside of Africa, which a lot of them are just copies of stuff that happened in one location of the world. So one place invents it, and then everybody else just starts copying the same type of thing. Obviously, the most impressive in Africa in terms of buildings is probably ancient Egypt.
in Anatolia, 11,000 years old, features massive stone megaliths, pillars, and other similar sites, younger and older. Temple build.
See, I wasn't even going to go here. So these are found in Senegambia, and the rest are going to be found in Ethiopia and Nigeria. These are pillars that are stood up, thought to represent individuals standing, so the bodies of human beings. So if you add these, again, now we just, 10 times what we had before.
In these regions was not only a central cultural expression, but also provided shade and communal gathering spaces.
By the best guesses of historians, these structures are religious symbols, and they represent things, possibly the stars, the arrangements, and possibly a gravesite, even though they haven't been checked 100%. And there were graves found. These structures are called tumuli, and they're found all over North Africa. They're found in the Sahel region of Africa. They're found in the southern Sahel region, and they're found all the way down to southern Africa, so near Great Zimbabwe, near Mapungubwe, and those areas. There are some that have possibly been uprighted by Khoisan people, because of course all you're doing is just moving a rock and making it stand. And those, over the years, have been completely ignored, because of course moving structures and Khoisan is not something that is put together a lot of the time.
By contrast, in sub-Saharan Africa, despite the intense sun which runs along the equator, we find no equivalent monumental stone temple architecture. Nothing resembling the enduring complexes of the Levant, Mesopotamia, or Europe arose there.
And this guy was trying to call TKM a racist. Meanwhile, he's here spewing this garbage as if it's like a true fact. Learn something first. What did that guy say again? Speak about things you know about, not about things you don't know about. Clearly, you don't know what you're talking about. By the way, you will see this over and over again, because the argument of removing black people from Egypt has nothing to do with the race of the Egyptians. It's really to say, actually, Africans, you guys never invented anything of any worth, which is why I sometimes just focus on our inventions rather than dealing with the racial aspect of it. Because the more popular it is, the less likely these people are going to be to trick someone. So when someone says they didn't have this, the guy says, no, I saw it. They had it.
Nubia doesn't count since it lies adjacent to Egypt and has had a strong Eurasian presence since the Neolithic.
Wow. So Nubia doesn't count, huh? Nubia it's just another place that doesn't count. Let's accept what he's saying for 1 second. So he says, because it's had other people's influence in there, it doesn't count. Okay, so then European structures don't count because those came from the Middle East. At least they were inspired heavily by the Middle Eastern structures. And a lot of the Middle Eastern ones don't count because they were inspired by a lot of the Turkish ones. So therefore, the only people we can say invented structures are the people of Göbekli Tepe, and then everybody else just sort of took the idea and ran with it. So the people of Turkey, the ancient Egyptians, the Mohenjo-Daro civilization, the Indian civilizations, the other ones in America, and the sub-Saharan Africans, because they didn't copy it from nobody. Those are the only people who can say they invented structures. Because, by the way, this is something that they always do. This cultural diffusion thing. It's an argument they love, but then when it comes to Africa, then it's like, no, because there was other people. No, it doesn't matter that there were other people. They built the stuff up. It's like saying right now that America doesn't build anything because, well, the Greeks did it first. So the Americans have never built a building in their life because the Greeks did it first. And there's no intelligence in America because the Greeks did it first. Or the Egyptians did it first, or whoever. Pick whoever you want. Because someone did something before you, you're stupid. So Shakespeare is not a good playwright because people were writing plays before him. There's no good scientists after like 40,000 years ago, because people were already engaging in what you could call science back then. Everybody else did nothing since then, because of course everything is just building on someone else's idea.
Its culture and genetics have been heavily shaped by Eurasians and Eurasian contact, both in antiquity and continuing into the present.
Well, isn't that amazing? Isn't it weird how somehow these Asiatics, when they start talking about them, they've got this superpower of travel, and then they meet people, but somehow those people don't know how to meet those people. So it's like they go into Libya, they go into Morocco, they go into all these places where there were already people, and then somehow they become the new people, and those people don't know how to walk the other way. Like, it's like a one directional thing. I don't know how black people's feet used to work back in the day, according to these people, but apparently Asiatic people know how to walk west into Africa, but black people don't know how to walk east. Somehow that road is open, and the people from Asia, the Asiatic regions, can go there. And you can see here now with Nubia as well, they're doing the same thing. Sudan as well. They walk down into Sudan, but somehow we don't know how to walk up into Egypt. They know how to walk into Ethiopia, but we don't know how to walk into Asia. They know how to walk every time the Swahili coast. They know how to get to the Swahili coast, but we don't know how to get back. The Europeans, they know how to get to West Africa. We don't know how to get into. We don't even go, hey, follow the same footsteps, but in reverse. Which, by the way, if you think of the biggest major movements around the world, you can't find too many examples where that happens. See, when there's a land bridge that goes into the Americas, they go back and forth there. They don't just go one directional. If you talk about South America and North America, they go back and forth. They don't just go one directional. If you go Japan and China, some people who were part of Japanese islands, they went to China or the Chinese regions, and the people who went from they go back and forth. The Pacific Islanders, they go back and forth. They don't just, it's not a one directional thing. Everybody else goes back and forth. Asians with Europeans. Some Europeans are found in Asia, some Asians are found in Europe. The Indo-Europeans, they're traveling back and forth. They're not traveling in one direction. And then somehow this large area of Africa, starting from Ethiopia all the way to Morocco, that entire region, everybody knows how to move into Africa, but somehow Africans don't know how to move into, not even out of Africa, just move in Africa, getting to Egypt and just stopping there.
Let's look at the ancient Egyptians. They walked around shirtless, okay, in the heat of the Saharan sun. So these are people who would have needed to have the requisite melanin content to be able to withstand that kind of heat. I don't think you would.
Now watch as he completely undermines his own argument. Honestly, there's nothing more entertaining, more satisfying, more validating than watching Afrocentrics dismantle their own nonsense. All you have to do is sit back and let them run their mouths. Observe.
This is how the Egyptians are depicted there, okay? This is how the Amu are depicted, or the Asiatic.
The Asiatic, or Levantine, is depicted shirtless, just like the Egyptian. Notice the Levantine falls within the same skin tone range as the Egyptian. Neither are black like the Nilotic, nor do they share Nilotic phenotypes. This depiction comes from the tomb of Seti I. And didn't he claim in an earlier video Levantines were black-skinned with black phenotypes until recently? At every turn there's another Afrocentric lie being exposed. They make it too easy and therefore lose every argument.
So I don't know if this is the image that is in question, because, this is not a very typically used around the African circle image. A lot of them don't accept it as a real one. But if we do look at this one, we can see if you look at the front, the Asiatic person is much paler. And of course, in the real one, not this image, the real first copy, it's not the real one, but the real first copy, the person is also very pale. Now, you must remember that this portrayal of them has to do with them showing up in Egypt. This person was not in Egypt. They're not in the heat of Egypt. No one is saying that people who live elsewhere are not allowed to take off their shirts. And of course, a lot of the people who lived in the Middle East took off their shirts. They also lived in a pretty hot environment. But there's a difference between taking off your shirt in some parts of the Middle East, in those other areas, and deep Egypt. And then, of course, we already discussed that a lot of the Asiatics would have been using sunscreen and stuff like that to protect themselves. And even though Africans also use sunscreen, you can see how it still deepens their skin color. Now, this person says, look at the similarities between the Asiatic skin color and the Tomb of Seti Egyptian, who's right behind the person. And the answer is no, there's not that much similarity. The other one is dark brown, and the other one is like palish, which is pretty weird, especially considering the fact that the original fake image or the original copy, the person is much lighter than they're being seen in this image here. I also want to say something which I'm trying to save for my video about the two lands, right? The two nations, the Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. But let me just throw it out there. These people are being separated mainly by nationality than they are by race. And the emphasis is usually showing a type of person that is super different rather than showing necessarily the most typical look of the people. And I'll get back to why I'm saying that in another video.
I don't think he believes the nonsense he projects from his perch, but rather is intent on shaking his spear at Western civilization.
But why has he got to be a spear? Why has he got to be a spear, though? Stop. Stop with your racism.
While he usurps and replaces.
If we look at the bottom, we have this clearly Levantine man. He's clearly a kind of Eurasian or Asiatic man. You can see it's in his.
And here's yet another example. He doubled down, making sure to stress that this was an Asiatic Levantine man. Shirtless, even unclothed. When Afrocentrics open their mouths too wide, they end up exposing themselves.
First of all, that Asiatic person is being disgraced. So the shirt, he's not just shirtless, you can see that he's pantsless too, because he is being disgraced. He's not being, that's not like him going to the shop or something.
The best way to deconstruct Afrocentrism is simply to use their own words against them.
Well, you completely failed in this area, so a change of strategy, perhaps?
Here we have more examples of shirtless Asiatic Levantines, just as able-bodied and perfectly capable of enduring the scorching Egyptian sun as any Egyptian, and why wouldn't they? The Levant sits right next door to Egypt on the very same latitude. So because Egyptians walked around shirtless is proof evidence they were black? The notion that Egyptians must have been black simply because they walked around shirtless is absurd, as you've seen Levantines without shirts in the hot sunny climate of Egypt side by side with Egyptians.
So what was his advice again? Use their own words against them. So he said, you see images of Egyptians standing side by Asiatics shirtless. So how do you know that those people are Asiatics then? If the Egyptians look like Asiatics, how can you tell that those people are Asiatics versus if they're Egyptian? Now, he could say labels, but I know a lot of those images don't have labels. I know that for a fact. And so is he just admitting that he can physically tell there's a difference between the way that ancient Egyptians are portrayed and Asiatics? I mean, clearly those ones are Asiatic because they have the beards and stuff. But even worse than that is that he's coming at it as if people are saying Asiatic people could never walk around with their shirt off in Egypt. No one's saying that. We're saying excessive work building pyramids all day with your shirt off. Have you ever seen the problems in the Middle East? They literally, like, traffic police collapse because of the sun.
Here we see Greek Minoans and Italian Etruscans, Europeans. Shirtless, what is his point other than Italy and Santorini are closer to Egypt than Congo, Cameroon, Lake Chad, Eritrea or Ethiopia?
So first of all, Minoans, when they're portrayed as very dark. There are some that are portrayed as white skin, but that tells us that there was a diversity in their skin range that was probably a sign of a changing people or a multi-ethnic civilization. By the way, in Minoan culture, there's a high push of North African DNA that ended up in those regions. So it's not a purely European civilization. So in his case, then he would say the Minoans have never done anything, since a lot of their inventions are based off of North African ideas. But of course, he won't say that because that would be a nonsense. But he uses it in Africa. You can then see the differences between the other Romans, the sort of lighter skinned Romans, now, well, Greeks and Romans or whatever. But you have to face something here, which is that they were actually darker in the early years. Now, I'm not saying they were like black people when they're like that, but they were darker. And this is admitted by the people when they say that the Gauls lighten their skin color. But here's what's even worse. Notice the difference between how the Egyptians, especially in that image, if you look at the very bottom 1, 2, 3, the third image from the start, or the second image from the back, the Minoans there, they have hair that's nothing like the Egyptians. And then you notice that this is the same for all the other European type people here.
A Hellenistic mosaic from Alexandria depicts an individual completely shirtless and even pantless walking beneath the blazing Saharan sun. So where is this so-called requisite melanin content this fraud insists upon? The irony is laughable. Afrocentrics claim Egypt was invaded, yet all...
Besides the fact that that image is not even that clear, that looks like it's indoors. So I don't even know why he's showing that image. That's a weird one.
Also insinuate that these very invaders, for some unknown reason, couldn't walk around shirtless in Egypt. Maybe TKM...
No one said they can't be shirtless in the area. It will have an effect on them, though. I'll tell you that much. Their skin will change if they walk around shirtless. But we're not talking about just walking around. Walking around, you could do that anyway. You can walk around on like a frozen piece of land. You could go to Antarctica and just walk around for a little bit until, the sickness starts to set in. We're not talking about just walking around. We're talking about working every single day for 25 years on a pyramid outside in the heat, bare-chested.
Can explain what the Greco-Romans were wearing while they constructed temples in Egypt, or Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, and...
Okay, so I'll tell you what the Greco-Romans were wearing when they were constructing temples in Egypt. They were fully clothed, and then they sent out slaves to go do the work for them. That's what happened. A lot of those slaves, by the way, came from other parts of Africa, whether it be Libya, whether it be the Sudanese region, or the native Egyptians themselves. And we know this is a fact because we even have fireplaces, well, let's say floor heating that was done by the Romans, where Basically, the people underneath the ground would work in scorching heat, putting fire so that people at the top could have luxury and a heated floor.
Dan. Oh, is he unaware of this? Mediterraneans are well adapted to their climate and knew how to use the resources to their advantage.
Well, there's a huge difference between North Africa and that side of the Mediterranean Ocean and the European side of it. In terms of heat, there's no real comparison.
You see the results of their ancient architecture today. Remember, he posted this forged plaster copy in a previous video. He didn't have a problem using it, even though it was fake and misidentified the parties, yet I see a whole army of scantily clad, shirtless Libyan men. And Libyans lived right there in the Sahara. They're not black in skin or phenotype, are they, Andy?
So let's start with a couple of claims, because he makes a couple claims. One, this is not a fake image. Let's start there. Secondly, these people here are not necessarily Libyans. They come from the side of the Libyans, and they might represent sea people in that sense. But let's say that they're Libyans. I've got no problem saying that these people are Libyans and they have pale skin and they are shirtless. This goes to the problem with the argument, which is look at the pharaoh's skin and then look at their skin. Then look back at the pharaoh's skin and then look back at their skin. Are you noticing a immediate problem here? So, of course, the problem would be that they say that the reason why the skin of the Egyptians look like this is because they're tanned from working outside. Well, these guys are shirtless, right? They're shirtless. So, if they're shirtless and they've got, they're fighting a battle, why is their skin not dark? At least not as dark as you would expect it to be. Now, I will admit that there's a lot of people where this will be a big problem for them because, of course, if these people are 100% Libyans, it poses the problem of having light-skinned Libyans being portrayed in ancient Egypt. Something that I have to say is not consistent forever when they portray Libyans. Libyan tribes probably came in various ways. Now, I know what you're going to say. Why would I say those people are sea people since they're dressed in the typical Libyan style? Well, there's a reason why I say that. And the real answer is because we have actual written documents that say that the Libyan tribes, they went into union or they came to fight as a group, joining with the sea people and other Asiatic tribes. So in other words, people from Asia who joined in the Mashwesh and all these other people to fight the Egyptians, which is at the same time period as this pharaoh that they're fighting right now. Again, I personally have no problem with accepting that some of the people who lived in Libya would have had this skin color, but you know, there's also a skepticism there because they might be representing a much more foreign element. But this image is not fake. This is a real image.
It's just as absurd as claiming people living along hot US coasts, tanning all day at the beach or enduring the blazing sun of the desert southwest must be black, when in reality, these are some of the least black populated regions in the country.
Okay. So, firstly, let's address the fact that most of the people who lived in America, because of that excessive heat you're talking about, had melanin, like strong amounts of it in their body. Then let's move on to something even more important. You ever been to the beach with white people before? You ever see them get skin like sunburned and then they're like, don't touch me. And every single step starts to burn them and stuff because the sun has done that to them at the beach. Don't try to lie now and act like they just can be adapted to that sun and can be fine. We know, bro. Don't do that lie. The people you're talking about saying that they would be perfectly fine in the sunlight or whatever and blah, blah, blah. because they in America they have to use a lot of chemical products in order to protect themselves, and they don't sit there in excessive heat. A lot of them sit under umbrellas and all this other stuff that you're talking about. Meanwhile, you could go to Africa right now, you find people working in the blazing sun. There are people working in the desert, just working, and they're not falling over or none of that.
Notice how close the Levant is to Egypt and Europe, for that matter. Of course, they share the same Mediterranean climate. They do not share the same diet or equatorial humid jungle climate as sub-Saharans. North Africa is not equatorial Africa.
So that is a deep lie because, of course, parts of Egypt were the Green Sahara. So they do share a lot the same, and they do share the same diet. And we know this because the Nubians and stuff had the same types of food. Now, there's an exception, which is Asiatic type peoples, as it's mentioned before, they tended to bake for staple foods, whereas the people in what you would call sub-Saharan African regions, they tend to cook their food in for the staple food. Especially this would make a little bit of a difference. Now, of course, both of them did bake and they did have bread, but bread was not as common in the southern regions. But that's only one thing. Then everything else is pretty much the same. Well, a lot of the things are pretty much the same. A lot of stuff, food wise.
Sub-Saharans, such as Bantu, are in reality adapted to their own actual environment of origin, the humid equatorial jungles that provide constant shade, not the Sahara Desert. What monumental structures did these people build that we could consider precursors to Egypt? They've had thousands of years just like everyone else. What did the Khoisan erect? The Pygmies? The Nilotic Dinka? Afrocentrics never bring this up. It's always Egypt and everyone else outside of Sub-Sahara.
I'm just going to show the same structures over and over again because, of course, he is just going to make up a lie about nothing for no reason. And yes, there's a lot of shade in Africa because there's a lot of trees, but there's also a lot of shade in many of the places that you just pointed out. You know, just because there's not a lot of trees doesn't mean I don't get it. Have you ever heard of like a cave? You ever heard of that? You do realize there wasn't as many people in the past as there are now. By the way, it is telling again to be obsessed with this idea that Africa never invented anything.
Bantu originated below the Sahara along the equatorial belt in humid tropical sub-Sahara. Their migration began roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, eventually reaching southern Africa by around 300 AD. What they did not do was migrate northward across the Sahara and suddenly appear in Egypt. To set context, 4,000 years ago equates to Egypt's Middle Kingdom around the 11th to 12th dynasty, far too late to have played any role in the foundation of Egyptian state formation. TK.
So I'm just going to be honest, I have no idea what this person is rambling about. And I think they're obsessed over the word Bantu for some reason. You do realize that West Africans have existed for like tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, really. So when someone says a Bantu type, they don't really mean from the Bantu migration. They just mean the people who would be similar to them historically. Which, by the way, genetics has already proven that they were in North Africa as early as 10,000 BC. We have their DNA. Sorry.
Knows this, but profits from spreading misinformation. Let's address the manufacture of textiles and clothing in ancient Egypt. If sub-Saharans had this so-called magical melanin content that supposedly enabled them to walk shirtless under the scorching Saharan sun, as these race-obsessed fanatics like TKM imply, then why would clothing even be necessary?
Oh, why would clothing be necessary? Could it be for the cold times? Maybe, you wear clothes so of the cold period. Another one, modesty, covering yourself up so you don't walk around swinging. Another one what else? When you sit down, you don't have to walk around with a blanket. So when you sit down, you can actually sit down on earth with your cloth. What else? There's like 100 reasons why you would invent clothes outside of trying to protect yourself from the sun. By the way, this guy can't even keep his point straight. He keeps saying that the claim isn't real, but it is real, and it goes against the actual point. It's like, what are you doing? Why are you contradicting your own self?
The very existence of Egyptian textile production undermines his absurd claim.
What about the fact that the oldest textiles found in Egypt are actually in the Nubian regions? What does that do? Does that go completely against everything you're talking about, or are you just going to ignore that part?
Eurasians brought textile production into Egypt and therefore the African continent. Looms, needles, yarn, weaving cloth, linen, flax, making garments. Clothing provided protection from the sun.
This argument is frail and it's weak and whatever, because you can still trade, even if we just accept that the linen just came from Asia. So what? It would have came through trade. What's that got to do with anything? But also, there's palm fibers and stuff like that. There's other stuff that they used to make clothing in earlier years, especially, and then they abandoned once they got into the routine of linen. So this idea that like, oh, they wouldn't have invented clothes without other people. No, they did invent clothes without other people, especially since clothes doesn't have to be like put together in the way that you're talking. You could just use animal skin like they did before, as most Africans did before.
In contrast, Sub-Sahara shows no evidence for any of this and therefore no cloth. The archaeological record is silent on this. Weaving arrived only with Eurasian migrants. Again, where is this supposed knowledge from Sub-Sahara?
The evidence is all around you, and you can tell because the cloths in Africa are designed in almost the exact same way all over the place, that they did not come with the European people or whatever this guy wants to say. As you can see, the styles of clothing of the Europeans are very different than that of the Africans. Not only that, but we have books where they literally write like, okay, these are the clothes that they made before we got there, and these are the clothes they made afterwards. A truly great example of this is the 3 ambassadors from the Kingdom of Congo who were first painted dressed in their native clothing and then dressed in European clothing.
What clothing technologies did Nilotics contribute to Egypt? What did Bantu, East Africans or Khoisan introduce? Inquiring minds want to know.
Inquiring minds who want to know can easily know by looking at it. You are not an inquiring mind. You are someone who makes up information from nothing. The last thing you can do is criticize, because you just make up information.
Afrocentrics love to repeat the empty phrase that knowledge came from the South, yet they cannot produce a shred of evidence to substantiate it. V-neck dresses, full-length tunics, half-length tunics, wraparounds, kilts, aprons, belts, sashes, kerchiefs, headbands, caps and loincloths were not sub-Saharan innovations.
Yes, they were, and so much more of the clothing that you will see from Africa if I make another video about it. I know some people don't like hearing about clothing in Africa, but this is why you need to hear about it, because people, they like denying it over and over again.
Why? Because these garments required looms, warp and weft threads, plain weave, etc., and the ability to ply, plait or pleat textiles, technologies that sub-Saharan societies never developed independently until recently. Without knowledge of weaving and the tools necessary, clothing traditions could not have arisen there.
So what is this then, if they never had it in that region? What are they doing here? Clearly, they're spinning cotton and then they're making clothing, something that they did for a couple thousand years. before the Europeans ever got there. So again, full of nonsense. Also, again, one of the nonsensical things that you say is that if it comes from elsewhere, that means that you didn't do it. Again, stupid thing to say, because this same clothes making technology in Europe came from Asia. So does that mean Europe has never invented clothing?
It has often been said that the Egyptians were the first masters of the art of weaving, but the earliest evidence of woven cloth comes not from Egypt, but from Kut al-Huik in Anatolia circa 6000 BC. It is possible that these fragments were woven on a warp-weighted loom, but the evidence equally favours a 2-bar loom known as a horizontal ground loom. It is this loom that is depicted on a Badarian pottery dish circa 5000 BC, 1,000 years after that of Kut al-Huik in Anatolia. When pictorial evidence of the ground loom first appeared in Badari, both the loom and the textile remains were in advanced stages of evolution. This means the loom and the practice of weaving had their precursors in Eurasia.
I was going to say, do you understand that something can be invented more than once, as there are people who were doing the same thing in the Americas, but I don't think you're going to appreciate that. You just think, oh, the earliest one who did it, therefore that's it.
Since the information was published in 1993, evidence for woven cloth has been pushed back 27,000 years, attributed to the Ice Age hunters of the Upper Paleolithic Stone Age, Gravettian people who stretched from Spain to southern Russia.
If that's true, then show it. Like though you just showed this information. Show that that is true what you just said. You're not going to, are you? Because you just made it up.
And if they were so adapted to Saharan desert sun and heat, why are Nilotic Sudanese wearing clothing here? So these were adapted and these weren't. So much for magical melanin.
Does this guy know how light Egyptian clothing was? Does he realize that it wasn't necessarily to block out the sun? Also, it could be that they were just dressing like the Egyptians. You ever consider that? That it's not a need, but a want?
And this is as dark as the ancient Egyptians ever got. Under the blazing Saharan sun, their complexions never approached that of Nilotics. The Egyptian artistic record makes this contrast crystal clear.
I mean, the ones you're showing are very dark, to be honest. So look at especially the ones at the bottom. They're very, very dark. But I guess you're just blind to that fact. Also, there are some that are way darker than those ones, but I don't have time to go fetch those. This video's already been an hour.
A line-up depictions of Egyptians beside Sudanese Nilotics, and the differences in skin tone, phenotype, and hair are unmistakable. Sudanese Nilotics or any sub-Saharan groups don't magically tan into looking like Egyptians. Skin tone reflects genetic adaptation, not just climate exposure.
Yeah, whatever. I'm so tired right now. I've actually don't feel like commenting what he said. So let's go into it. Okay, so he said in the beginning that their hair is very different, but he didn't show any of the hair that would be similar between the quote-unquote Nubians and the quote-unquote Egyptians. The second thing that he said is the Nubians don't turn to Egyptians. Who said they turn to Egyptians? What are you talking about?
Anyone looking at these visuals can immediately distinguish Egyptians apart from Nilotics. No amount of Afrocentric spin can erase these artistic and biological facts.
I understand your point. So now try these black Egyptians, and now you tell me if what you're saying is true, then why is this reflected? It's because you're done for. It's over. You have no arguments. Goodbye.
The long-standing isolation of Sub-Sahara emphasizes the profound genetic differences from the northern portion of the continent, a pattern already established during the late Paleolithic, thus explaining why North Africans, including Egyptians, are genomically much closer to West Eurasians than Sub-Saharans. The distinction is real. It means Egypt and the broader North African cultural sphere developed from a fundamentally different population base than that of sub-Saharan Africa. Afrocentric claims collapse here because the genetic, archaeological, and historical record all point to North Africa being a unique crossroads tied to Eurasia, not an extension of sub-Saharan populations.
Yeah, we'll discuss genes another time. I have no time to get into a debate with you over genetics. First of all, you lie about simple things, so you will lie deeply about genetics.